guard. We guarantee.
Stay with WION World is One for live updates. Raging battlefronts, political ultimatums, things are moving thick and fast on both fronts. U.S. President Donald Trump says it's time for Ukraine's president to decide. Zelensky must end the war. Zelensky cautions that Russia should not be rewarded for war, with deadly new strikes rocking Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia. European leaders are crowding Washington for NATO unity. The future of Ukraine hangs in the balance. But first, let's talk about the battlefield. These are the latest images coming in from Kharkiv. The second largest city in Ukraine is under devastating attack. Images of destruction tell their own story. In Kharkiv, 7 killed, 19 injured after Russian missiles ripped through residential buildings. Similar scenes of horror with residents in shock and rescue workers rushing to extinguish the flames. Moscow has repeatedly denied that it does hit any civilian targets. Take a listen.
I want to say that this is not a military house. Families live here, children, youth, old people. There is no military object here, but still every Shaheed drone hit it. You can all ask why this is happening.
In Zaporizhzhia, another strike left 3 dead, 20 wounded, with rescue workers pulling survivors from the rubble. The war is unrelenting, the civilian death toll mounting by the hour.
Two missile strikes were carried out against the city of Zaporizhzhia from the side of the Russian Federation. The strikes took place in the residential part of the city.
Ukraine, too, is hitting back. Kyiv's drones have struck deep inside Russian territory, targeting refineries and depots, a show of defiance that Moscow calls escalation. Zelensky and European leaders would be meeting Trump in Washington in just a few hours from now. This is a follow-up to a summit before Trump and Putin in Alaska on Friday that failed to produce a ceasefire. Trump and Zelensky are expected to meet one-on-one before being joined by the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Finland, as well as NATO chief Mark Rutte and European Commission chief Ursula von der Leyen. Last time when Trump met Zelensky, it was a slugfest, with the Ukrainian president facing the ire of Trump. This time, Washington insists that European leaders aren't their shield to Zelensky.
But that's not true. They're not coming here tomorrow to keep Zelensky from being bullied. They're coming here tomorrow because we've been working with the Europeans. We talked to them last week. There were meetings in the UK over the previous weekend.
European leaders, meanwhile, are in the U.S. capital, not just for Ukraine, but also for NATO.
We've got to make sure there is peace, that it is lasting peace, and that it is fair and that it is just. And that's why I'm travelling to Washington with other European leaders to discuss this face-to-face with President Trump and President Zelensky, because it's in everyone's interests, it's in the UK's interests that we get this right.
European leaders framed their presence as a show of unity, a declaration that the survival of the Western military bloc itself hangs in the balance. What happens in Washington will ripple through Brussels, Berlin, and beyond.
European leaders need to find out what actually Donald Trump has agreed with Vladimir Putin, because as we know, he completely reframed the discussion from a ceasefire to a sweeping peace agreement. This is something that wasn't agreed before with the European leaders, who agreed on the ceasefire first, and then with broader discussions on Ukrainian and European security.
Joining me on this broadcast from Geneva is Dr. Zachary Pankin, who is a security analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. President Trump last night in a social media post said that it is now up to Volodymyr Zelensky to end the war. Has he just plumed off the onus on Kyiv, in your opinion?
Well, to be honest, of course, it is Russia who started this war that is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine. So in that sense, it would not be accurate to say that Ukraine is the primary obstacle to peace. That said, the different actors, the different belligerents in this conflict are only going to have their very disparate positions brought closer together if the United States applies pressure on all of them. And that involves a series of different carrots and sticks that need to be used at the same time. And right now, you've got a situation where you had going into the Alaska meeting, as you just said, the European players and Ukraine who wanted a ceasefire first, before any discussion of the larger issues. And that is very much the opposite of what Russia's approach is. There are also differences of opinion in terms of whether or not Ukraine should have the right to enter NATO. So these positions will have to be bridged, and they can only be bridged through American leadership and mediation.
Dr. Pakin, what are the stakes for Europe and NATO as a whole? How important was it for European leaders to rush to Washington for this meeting?
Well, I would say that this is probably the most significant day for European security since the end of the Cold War. A lot is going to be riding on what happens in Washington today. If the European leaders and President Zelensky leave Washington today having not budged an inch from the positions that they had as of last week, then I think that this entire peace process will very much be on life support. If, however, we see some pragmatic movement from some of them, a little bit closer to the middle ground, then it could be that we're, much closer than we think to a framework agreement that could be followed on by the implementation of a ceasefire. But that requires, Ukraine and European countries to concede to reality, and that just means, whether we like it or not, that NATO membership for Ukraine is just going to have to be off the table. Since 2008. We have been seeing Western countries promise to bring Ukraine into NATO at some point, but they have not yet done so. We've now seen, since the start of full-scale war 3.5 years ago, 2 different U.S. presidents under different political banners, one Republican, one Democrat. Neither of them, have been willing to fight for Ukraine in this war. It very much begs the question of whether or not they'd be willing to fight for them in the future. And Article 5 of NATO, of course, it only works if it's credible. And so, bringing Ukraine into NATO would not be credible. It wouldn't work. And so it needs to be put off the table, and just Ukraine's military status and orientation needs to be clarified as a neutral country. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be security guarantees of some kind. That's one thing to keep an eye out for today. There need to be security guarantees of some kind for Ukraine, but not NATO membership.
Very interesting. Of course, we'll be watching very closely and covering it here on WION. Thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to speaking to you again very soon as we watch and have this story develop.
Thanks for having me.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.